He stepped out of the tree line barefoot and silent, watching the world like it might strike. No one knew where he came from or why headlights made him tense. But when the timber vultures offered help, they uncovered secrets buried deeper than the woods themselves. Who was this boy, and how had he survived alone so long? The Ridge Trail had its share of strange stories, but none quite like the whispers about a barefoot boy slipping between the trees at dawn. Campers talked about him in low voices, thin, fast, never saying a word. Some swore they saw him squatting by the river, hands cupped in the water like a wild animal. Others joked he was a ghost, a trick of the morning fog. The timber vultures MC mostly laughed it off. Rural towns collected myths the same way their clubhouse collected dust on old beer signs. But Oscar didn't laugh. He had spent years in Army recon units, trained to notice what others brushed past. And when he spotted a line of perfectly spaced footprints deep in the pines, small, fresh, and unaccompanied by any adult pattern, his stomach tightened. A child's stride, traveling lightly, hugging the natural cover. Not wandering, hiding. He followed the trail until he spotted something that stopped him cold. A handmade snare built from twine, pine needles, and a bent metal hook. Not dangerous, but functional. Someone young had crafted it with the precision of someone who depended on catching food. He told the club that night. Doug, the president and former police officer, frowned. "You think the kid's real?" Oscar didn't answer. He didn't have to. 2 days later, while the club was cleaning up after a cookout, movement flickered at the tree line. Victoria was the first to turn. She froze, her spatula hanging midair. There he was, a boy maybe 10 years old, barefoot, shirt frayed into threads, skin reddened from sun and wind, hair tangled into long, uneven strands. But what struck them most were his eyes, wide, watchful, and quiet in a way that didn't belong on a child. He didn't step forward so much as drift closer, as if pulled by exhaustion. The club didn't move. Instinct said too much motion would send him running. They waited until he stood only 10 feet away, staring at the food on the table, then at the fire pit. His breathing was shallow, but steady. No fear, no trust, only survival. Victoria approached slowly, holding a plate of cornbread. "Sweetheart, you hungry?" He didn't speak. He didn't nod. He simply reached out, took the food with careful fingers, and ate like he wasn't sure it would still be there in a moment. When they called child services, the social worker sounded tired before she even arrived. "We're full," she admitted after checking her laptop. "There are no emergency placements open tonight." Doug crossed his arms. "He's not sleeping outside again." The social worker hesitated, then eyed the club's campground. "If you can keep him on site, supervised, just until I find a placement, it would be a lifesaver." Victoria didn't wait. "He stays with us." They led him to the side cabin, a small structure used mostly for storage and overflow guests. Victoria swept out dust while Oscar adjusted the lanterns. The boy didn't resist, didn't react much at all. His silence wasn't shy, it was practiced. "What's your name, kid?" Doug asked gently. The boy only sat by the fire pit outside the cabin, staring at the embers as though he belonged to them. Ash, Victoria thought. He sits where the heat dies down. "Ash," she said aloud. "We'll call you Ash for now. Does that sound all right?" He blinked once. Not a yes, not a no, but he didn't look away. Over the next days, Ash behaved like someone who had lived under rules no one else could see. He ate in small, controlled bites, slept curled on top of the blanket rather than beneath it, avoided doors unless someone else opened them first. Yet he didn't cower, didn't cling. He moved with a quiet confidence, like a creature who had learned the forest's language and wasn't sure yet how to speak this new one. He watched everything. How Oscar sharpened tools, how Victoria folded towels, how Doug checked tire pressure. But the bikes fascinated him most. Whenever engines rumbled to life, Ash drifted closer, standing just within the edge of heat and sound. Oscar caught him tracing the chrome with his eyes, as if memorizing the shapes. The club quickly learned his rhythms. He woke before sunrise. He never asked for anything. He startled not at loud noise but at the soft click of a latch closing. Sometimes, when headlights crossed the cabin at night, his shoulders tightened. Not fear, readiness. Victoria tried speaking to him while cooking breakfast. "You're safe here," she'd say gently. Ash listened, absorbing her tone more than her words. On the fifth morning, Oscar found him outside near the riverbed, crouched exactly the way campers had described in their stories. But this time, Ash looked back at him, not with panic, but with the faintest spark of recognition. Oscar crouched too, matching his posture. "You don't have to run anymore," he said. Ash's gaze drifted toward the pines. Not fear, memory. He placed a small, smooth stone into Oscar's hand, a gesture without explanation, then walked at Oscar's pace back toward the cabin. People joked he was a ghost story, a shadow stitched into the woods. But ghosts don't mark the earth with real footprints or build traps with trembling hands. Ghosts don't look at you like they're waiting to see if you're safe. The timber vultures didn't know who he was or where he came from. But the moment Ash chose to follow them back to the cabin, they understood something unmistakable. The forest hadn't just kept him alive. It had been protecting him from something far worse. The first week felt like learning the weather patterns of a child who didn't know how to be one. Ash didn't speak, but he communicated in movements, quick glances, shifts of posture, the way he froze whenever someone approached from behind. Victoria learned to announce herself softly. Oscar learned not to reach too fast for tools when Ash was nearby. Doug, usually gruff, lowered his voice around him without realizing it. Ash watched them more than he acted. He watched how they poured coffee, how they checked maps, how they laughed at small jokes. He studied human life like someone observing a world he wasn't sure belonged to him. Yet something subtle changed when Victoria lit the fire pit each evening. The moment the flame caught, Ash moved closer. He sat on the packed dirt, arms around his knees, and stared at the fire with a stillness so complete it almost felt sacred. Victoria realized he wasn't mesmerized, he was measuring. The heat, the boundaries, the safety. "Do you like the fire?" she asked one night. Ash didn't look at her, but his posture loosened as though the flame translated her voice into something he understood. So she kept lighting it. On the 9th day, the social worker returned. Ash shrank behind Oscar when the woman stepped out of the car. An instinct, not fear of her, but fear of unknown authority. She sighed deeply as she scanned her tablet. "I'm still trying, but there are no placements open. Every foster home within 3 counties is full." Victoria exchanged a glance with Doug. "He stays," she said simply. The social worker hesitated, then nodded. "I'll file for temporary supervised care, but we need information from him. Anything." Oscar crouched in front of Ash. "Buddy, can you tell us something about where you lived?" "Nothing." Ash stared at Oscar's boots, fingers tightening around the hem of his shirt. "It's okay," Oscar said. "You talk when you're ready." That night, while the club cooked dinner, Ash walked toward the fire pit carrying something cupped in both hands. He opened his palms. A single pine cone, perfectly cleaned of dirt, rested on his skin. "For me?" Victoria asked, unsure. Ash nodded barely but unmistakably. The club didn't celebrate, didn't clap, didn't overwhelm him. They simply accepted it. A small offering, a small step. From that night forward, Ash began repeating certain words Victoria used around camp. Bowl, water, warm. The sound of his own voice startled him each time, but he kept trying. Oscar took him to the workbench behind the clubhouse, where spare chains and tools hung in neat rows. "These aren't traps," Oscar said gently, showing him a wrench. "Just tools." He placed it in Ash's hand. Ash lifted the tool to his nose, breathing in the scent of cold iron, then gripped it with the caution of someone who'd once learned the hard way that objects could hurt. When Oscar showed him how it worked, Something like curiosity flickered across his face. A small flame, but real. Midweek, Doug brought a school counselor named Mara Hayes to evaluate him. She approached with warm eyes and a notebook tucked under her arm. Ash stayed near the fire, watching her with the same guarded interest he gave to storms rolling over the ridge. Mara crouched beside him. "I won't take you anywhere," she said calmly. "I'm just here to understand what you remember." Ash pressed his shoulder lightly into Oscar's knee, a silent statement of where he felt safer. Mara kept her distance. "Ash, do you remember any houses? A road? Anyone calling your name?" Ash's lips moved. A soft breath left him, shaped like the beginning of a word, but the sound collapsed before it could form. "That's all right," she said. "Your mind is protecting you." When she left, she pulled Doug aside. "He's not mute. He's conditioned. Whoever he ran from didn't want him talking." That night, the headlights from a truck rolled briefly across the cabin wall. Ash stiffened immediately, eyes snapping open, feet ready to bolt. Oscar, sitting on the porch, raised both hands. "No one's coming for you," he said gently. "Not here." Ash didn't relax until the taillights disappeared down the road. Over time, patterns emerged. He hated sudden brightness but wasn't bothered by thunder. He flinched at seatbelt clicks but leaned closer whenever an engine rumbled. Victoria noticed he always positioned himself between the fire and the tree line, as if guarding his escape route. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Ash finally approached Oscar unprompted. He tugged on the sleeve of Oscar's denim jacket and pointed toward the canopy of pines. "You want to go?" Oscar asked softly. Ash nodded once. Oscar led him on a slow walk through the woods, letting him guide the pace. Ash stepped over roots with the precision of someone who knew every sound the forest could make. He stopped at a fallen log and touched the bark, eyes tracing the grooves as if remembering something buried beneath them. Oscar didn't push him. "It's okay to remember," he said quietly. "It's okay not to, too." Ash crouched, touched the mud with 2 fingers, then drew a small curved line. It looked like a road. Then he dragged his hand sharply through it, breaking the shape. Oscar's chest tightened. "An accident?" Ash didn't look up, but his breathing faltered just once. They walked back without another word. When they reached the cabin, Victoria had the fire going again. Ash went straight to it, sitting where he always did, close enough to feel warmth, not close enough to burn. The flame reflected in his eyes, and Oscar understood the truth behind that unwavering stare. Ash wasn't afraid of fire. He was learning to live in a world where someone finally kept it lit for him. The chipped tooth was the first real clue. It came from a simple moment, Ash biting awkwardly into an apple Victoria handed him, wincing when the edge caught the enamel. She'd insisted on taking him to Dr. Kellen, the town's only pediatric dentist, who was more used to cavities and braces than children who'd lived off river water and berries. Kellen wasn't prepared for Ash's silence, or for the way he watched every instrument like it might be taken from him. But the tooth? That he recognized immediately. "I've seen this repair before," he murmured to Victoria when Ash stepped outside with Oscar. "It's not common, maybe 8 or 9 years old. I need to check something." He disappeared into a back room, flipping through old files long retired to storage. When he returned, his face was pale. There was a child reported missing 3 years ago. Same age Ash would have been. Same tooth. But the case went cold. Victoria's heart squeezed. What was his name? Cameron Wyatt. The name meant nothing to her then. But when she told Doug, his jaw tightened, the way it did only when instinct told him danger wasn't far behind. "Wyatt Timber?" he asked. "As in the company that bought half the ridge?" Oscar was already shaking his head. "Doesn't matter who he was. What matters is who's looking for him now." But someone was already looking. 2 days later, a black SUV with rental plates rolled slowly past the campground entrance. The windows were tinted. The driver didn't stop, just circled once, then returned to the highway. The club exchanged uneasy glances. Doug didn't like coincidences. He called an old contact, Ruth Collins, a retired FBI agent who owed him after he helped her son years ago. "I need a favor," he said simply. "Quiet one." Ruth arrived the next morning in hiking boots and a windbreaker, blending in with the campground like she belonged there. Ash froze when he saw her badge tucked away in her jacket, not visible but remembered. Something in him recognized authority even without words. Ruth kept a respectful distance. "I'm not here to take him," she said gently. "I'm here to make sure no one else does." They gathered around the fire pit, Victoria, Doug, Oscar, and Ruth, while Ash sat close enough to hear but far enough to retreat if he needed. Ruth laid out a thin folder. "The Wyatt case was messy," she explained. "Parents died in an alleged car accident. Cameron vanished. The uncle took over the company within a week. Investigators suspected the crash was staged, but nothing was proven. Then the boy disappeared from the hospital before questioning." Victoria swallowed hard. "He was in a hospital?" "Briefly. Injuries consistent with running barefoot through broken brush. He panicked and escaped before staff could stop him. After that, no sightings. Nothing." Oscar looked at Ash, who was turning a twig in his fingers. "He didn't run because he was confused," he said quietly. "He ran because someone told him to hide." Ruth studied Ash's posture, the way he faced the fire but kept one ear toward the woods. "Children don't learn hypervigilance on their own," she murmured. "Someone taught him to stay unseen." That afternoon, Ash wandered toward the path leading into the pines, something he hadn't done in days. Oscar followed at a respectful distance. Ash stopped near a mossy outcrop. His breathing tightened. Slowly, he knelt and touched a shallow groove carved into the bark of a tree, 2 lines intersecting a circle. A symbol, a memory. Oscar crouched beside him. "Did you make that?" Ash hesitated, then traced the shape again. When he looked at Oscar, his eyes held something new, fear layered with recognition. "Cam," he whispered, voice cracking like it wasn't used to carrying meaning. Oscar's breath caught. "Cameron?" he repeated softly. Ash flinched, but he didn't run. He pressed his palm to the tree, as though anchoring himself to something that existed before the forest swallowed his life whole. When they returned, Victoria dropped to her knees beside him. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "is that your name? Cameron?" Ash didn't speak, but he closed his eyes and leaned into her touch, a fragile permission. That night, Ruth dug deeper. "If he remembers," she said, "then anyone who orchestrated his disappearance will want to erase the threat he represents. He's the rightful heir, and if the estate audit clears, he's worth millions." Doug exhaled slowly. Money didn't keep him alive in that forest. "No," Ruth agreed, "but taking it from him nearly killed him." While they talked, Ash stood at the cabin window watching the distance where the woods met the road. The headlights of a passing truck swept across his face. He didn't hide this time. He simply watched, eyes tracing the movement as if comparing it to something buried deep. Then he whispered again, barely audible, "Cam, Aaron." Oscar heard it from the porch. He wasn't telling them everything yet. Couldn't, but a door inside him had cracked open, and they all felt it. The timber vultures exchanged a look that needed no words. They weren't just sheltering a lost boy anymore. They were protecting the last surviving Wyatt. And whoever had tried to silence him 3 years ago was unlikely to let him stay silent now. Ruth didn't waste time once Ash whispered his name out loud. She moved with the quiet urgency of someone who knew a fuse had been lit. By dawn, she was already on the clubhouse porch, laptop open, cross-referencing old Wyatt timber reports that had been buried under layers of legal noise. "This is worse than I thought," she said, rubbing her eyes. "The uncle, Barrett Wyatt, didn't just assume control. He reorganized the entire board in 48 hours. No trustee oversight, no guardian paperwork. The estate was meant to be locked until Cameron turned 18. Oscar paced behind her. So he took everything. Not just took it, Ruth said. He sealed it. If Cameron stayed missing, Barrett kept full control indefinitely. Outside, Ash sat on the cabin steps with Victoria, a blanket draped around his shoulders. He didn't look cold, he looked overwhelmed. Words still didn't come easily, but the tension in his posture said enough. Ever since whispering his name, he seemed caught between the boy he'd become in the woods and the life he'd forgotten. Victoria rubbed his back gently. "You're safe," she murmured. "Nothing changes that." But something did change. A white sedan pulled into the gravel lot mid-morning, driven by a woman who introduced herself as Lauren McHale, a child trauma specialist Ruth had called in. She had a softness to her step, the kind that made animals choose to approach her first. Ash didn't walk toward her, but he didn't retreat either. He watched her with the cautious interest of someone trying to understand new weather. Lauren knelt at his level. "Hi, Cameron," she said softly. "I'm not here to take you away. I'm here to help your mind catch up to your heart." Ash's fingers curled around the blanket's edge. Not fear, focus. Inside the clubhouse, Ruth laid out the plan. To protect him legally, we need emergency guardianship assigned to someone who can provide stability. Victoria fits every state requirement. And she's already bonded with him. Victoria blinked. "Me? You've been caring for him since day one," Ruth said. "And he trusts you. If Barrett tries to make a move, guardianship gives us ground to fight back." The weight of it settled over the room, but Victoria didn't back away. "Then do it," she said. "Whatever keeps him safe." As the hours passed, a quiet tension settled over the campground, the kind that makes even the birds go silent. Doug stationed 2 bikers at the entrance. Oscar took the ridge trail with binoculars. They weren't preparing for violence. They were preparing for interference. Barrett Wyatt had resources, lawyers, money, and a reputation for getting what he wanted. And finally, he showed his hand. A man in a suit stepped out of an SUV around 3 o'clock, accompanied by another carrying a briefcase. They didn't enter the campground. They simply stood at the edge of the gravel, arms folded, waiting to be acknowledged. Doug walked to them alone. "Gentlemen," he said, voice steady. "We're here on behalf of the Wyatt family," the taller one replied. "We have reason to believe a minor under your care is Cameron Wyatt." "You believe correctly," Doug said. "We'll need him released to us immediately." Doug didn't blink. "He isn't going anywhere." The men exchanged a puzzled glance. "Sir, this is a legal matter. You don't have authority." A new voice cut in. "He does now." Ruth stepped forward, holding a fresh document stamped by a judge she'd woken at dawn. "Emergency guardianship. Signed. Effective immediately. And unless you have a court order overriding this," she continued, "you're trespassing on private property. You'll leave now." The men hesitated, long enough for her to know they hadn't expected resistance, but eventually retreated to their SUV and drove off. That night, the fire pit glowed brighter than usual. The club gathered around it quietly, not celebrating, just grounding themselves in the warmth. Ash sat between Victoria and Oscar, his shoulders less rigid than they'd been hours before. Lauren joined them, sipping tea from a metal cup. "He's remembering in small flashes," she told Victoria. "But memory isn't just pictures. It's feeling. He remembers fear, running, instructions to hide. Someone taught him to be invisible." Victoria looked at Ash, who was tracing circles in the dirt with his finger. "We'll teach him the opposite." When Ash finally spoke again, it wasn't a name. It was a question, not fully formed, but clear enough to break Victoria's heart. "Home?" he asked, touching his chest, then pointing to the cabin. Victoria nodded, her eyes misting. "Yes, sweetheart. This is your home. As long as you want it." Ruth watched from across the fire, rare emotion in her face. "You know," she murmured to Doug, "cases like this don't usually end with safety. They end with appeals, custody fights, media storms." "Not this one," Doug said. We're not letting him disappear again. Ash moved closer to the fire, letting the heat brush his skin. This time, he didn't stay rigid. He leaned into it like he recognized warmth as something meant for him. The club spoke softly around him, planning school enrollment under his new name, arranging counseling sessions, discussing how to shield him from press if the story broke wide. Ash listened, quiet but present. He didn't understand the future they were shaping around him. Not yet. But one truth finally settled inside him. Quiet, steady, undeniable. Headlights wouldn't send him running into the trees anymore. Voices wouldn't snap him to attention. And the next person to step onto the gravel wouldn't be someone deciding his fate for him. The long, cold stretch he'd survived had given way to something warm and consistent. Real people. Real safety. So when Ash glanced toward the tree line that night, it wasn't fear that pulled his eyes there. It was the echo of a life he'd had to leave behind, something he could face now without bracing for harm. He looked at the woods the way someone looks at an old scar, aware of it, no longer ruled by it. Stories like this remind us that family isn't always the one you're born into. Sometimes it's the people who refuse to let you disappear. If you were standing on that ridge and saw a child step out of the trees, what would you do? Share your thoughts below, and if this journey moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to embrace the journey for more stories that stay with you long after they end.